If you're going to build an entire romance around a curse that can only be broken by mating with your fated partner, you better understand exactly what kind of fire you're playing with, because one wrong move and it turns from dark fantasy into accidental nightmare fuel. And that's why I was so surprised by how much I got pulled into Claimed by the Dragon, this 2026 fantasy romance that looks you straight in the eye and says, yes, the premise is messy, yes it's morally loaded, now watch what we do with it. I'm talking heartbreak, menace, longing, and that very specific kind of tension where you can feel two characters falling toward each other while the plot keeps putting knives on the floor between them. You're watching Bongo Gaming, and if you end up liking how I break these down, consider subscribing. Soft ask, no pressure. Also, I'm going full spoilers today, because with a story like this, the details are the whole point. The setup is instantly soap opera cruel in a way that fantasy romance fans recognize in their bones. We've got Asher, the Dragon King, cursed. His survival is literally tied to claiming his true fated partner. Not finding love, not learning empathy, not proving he's worthy. Survive. And then we've got Alina, a human girl who gets betrayed by her stepmother and sacrificed to the dragon clan like she's a peace offering wrapped in ribbon. That's the first big tone statement. This isn't a world where humans and dragons are just mildly prejudiced against each other. This is a world where a girl can be traded like a coin and the people who should protect her are the ones who spend her. And then the kicker, because there's always a kicker, humans were never meant to mate with dragons. If Asher claims her virginity, the curse breaks, and Alina burns alive in his arms. So suddenly, it's not just monster romance with fate, it's intimacy as execution, it's desire as a trap, it's love as a loaded gun that might save him and kill her in the same breath. And here's the thing, with that kind of premise, I braced myself. I went intense. Because a lot of shows want the shock value of that setup, but they don't want the responsibility of it. They want the heat, the taboo, the danger, and they want you to swoon, but they do not want to sit in the reality of what it means when a woman's body is the key to a man's survival and her death is the price of his healing. Claimed by the Dragon actually seems aware of that weight, and that awareness, more than the dragons, more than the castle, more than the whole fated mate mythology, is what made me stay. Not because it's perfect. It isn't. But because it's trying to wrestle the premise into something emotionally legible instead of just using it as a decorative excuse to press two attractive people together. Now let me get specific about what worked for me early on, because the show's first major win is atmosphere. Dragonstone, yes, I know some of you just flinched at that name because you've been burned by other fandom associations. I get it, I did the same little, wait a second, double take. Dragonstone here is less grand tourist fantasy and more beautiful prison. It's cold beauty. Sharp beauty. The kind of place where the architecture looks like it was grown rather than built, like the stone has bones in it. Visually, the show leans into a palette that makes humans look warm and breakable and makes the dragon spaces feel mineral, ancient, and indifferent. You can feel that this is a kingdom that will outlive any single person in it. And when Alina arrives, the camera treats her like the smallest moving thing in a world that does not care if she's there at all. Stick with me, because this is where the show quietly tells you what it's about. It's not just girl meets monster. It's girl is swallowed by a system. The stepmother betrayal matters, not only because it's evil, but because it sets Alina's baseline reality. Before dragons, before curses, before any romance, Alina already knows what it feels like to be disposable. That changes how she reads Asher. It changes how she survives him. And it changes how we, as viewers, process the romance, because her desperation doesn't start at Dragonstone. It starts at home. There's a moment early on, this is me doing full spoilers like I promised, where the sacrifice element hits in a way that's less about plot and more about sensory dread. You can practically hear the silence around her. Not peaceful silence. The kind of silence that happens when people have decided you're already gone. I loved, and I mean loved, how the show lingers on the human details right before the fantasy swallows her, fabric rubbing against skin, the drag of feet, the little swallow in the throat when someone is trying not to cry because crying won't change anything. When she's handed over, it's not a big heroic struggle sequence. It's worse. It's procedural. That's the word. It's like paperwork. Like the adults in the room have done this before, and they are just getting through it. And I'm telling you, that's the kind of directing choice that makes a trope feel like a wound. And then Asher. Let's talk about the Dragon King, because if the show fumbles him, the whole thing collapses. On paper, cursed Dragon King who needs his fated mate, is dangerously close to a checklist character. Tall, tortured, scary, secretly soft, probably has a tragic past tucked in a drawer somewhere. But claimed by the dragon gives him a particular kind of presence, less flirtatious predator, more starving monarch. He doesn't feel like he's enjoying the power imbalance. He feels like he's being poisoned by it. The curse isn't just a convenient engine to force proximity, it reads like something that has rotted his sense of self, like he can't trust any desire he has because desire might just be the curse speaking through him. And I'm going to say something that might sound like I'm defending him, but I'm actually praising the writing. The show doesn't ask you to find Asher safe. It asks you to find him conflicted. That's a different thing. He is dangerous because his survival is on the line, and desperation makes monsters out of people who might otherwise have chosen better. The show keeps that tension alive in the way it frames him, often shot from angles that emphasize scale, distance, the sense that he is always one step away from becoming something she can't talk to anymore. But it also lets you see the moments where he's trying to build a line he won't cross. Trying. Not succeeding every time, but trying. Here's the rehook, because I know what you're thinking. With a premise like, if he claims her virginity, she dies, how does the show even make romance possible without it becoming grotesque? That's the tightrope. And the show's biggest flex, when it works, is that it makes the central relationship less about the act and more about the threat of the act. Their intimacy becomes this strange battlefield where every step closer emotionally increases the danger physically. It's like the usual slow-burn romance structure, but weaponized. Every longing glance isn't just a longing glance, it's a countdown timer. Alina, as a character, is written with a survival intelligence that I appreciated. She's not a perfect girl boss, and thank God for that, because that archetype would feel like cosplay in this setting. She's frightened, and she should be. She's angry, and she's allowed to be. But she's also observant. She's constantly scanning who has power, who's pretending not to, where the exits are, what the rules are, which rules can be broken without immediate death. That makes her feel like a real person inside a fantasy premise, not just a chess piece moved into the dragon's bedroom. And I'm not going to dance around it, a forced marriage setup is inherently loaded. The show knows it. The marriage here isn't romantic, it's political, mystical, and coercive all at once. Alina is forced to marry him, and that phrase matters. If you're someone who can't stand non-consensual frameworks in romance narratives, I'm not here to argue you into watching it. I'm just telling you what the show does with it. It uses the forced marriage not as the romance itself, but as the cage the romance has to claw its way out of. The love story, when it lands, is about two people trying to reclaim choice inside a curse and a contract and a culture that has already decided what their bodies are for. One of the smartest structural moves is how the show positions freedom as a real option for Alina, not just a word she says to sound strong. The writing keeps reminding you that she wants out, that she's not just passively waiting for the Dragon King to become hot enough that captivity feels like destiny. She's weighing routes, alliances, costs. And that matters, because it makes every moment of softness between her and Asher feel earned and terrifying at the same time. Like, if she starts caring, the care becomes leverage against her. There's a certain kind of scene, if you've watched a lot of romance dramas, you know exactly what I mean, where the couple is forced into proximity, they argue, and then suddenly it's all breath and lips and swelling music, and the show pretends the argument was foreplay. Claimed by the dragon mostly avoids that cheap move. When Alina pushes back, the show doesn't immediately eroticize it. It lets conflict sit as conflict. It lets anger be ugly. It lets fear make people say things they regret. That's not only more mature, it's also more romantic in the long run, because it creates the possibility of actual trust instead of just chemistry as a smokescreen. Now, I do have critiques, and I'm going to be honest because I like this enough to want it to be better. The virginity aspect is a landmine. Not because sex can't be part of a fantasy curse narrative, but because virginity as a magical switch is culturally gross in a way that a lot of stories just don't interrogate. It risks reducing Alina to a condition rather than a person. When the show frames it as if he claims her virginity, it's invoking purity language that can either be critiqued or accidentally reinforced, depending on how carefully the scenes are built. And here's my contrarian take, the one that might annoy both sides. I actually think the show is at its most interesting when it leans into that discomfort instead of trying to soften it. Because if you sand off the disturbing edges, you don't get a healthier romance, you get a dishonest one. The world therein is brutal. The curse is brutal. If the story pretends that brutality isn't there, then it becomes exploitation. But when the story acknowledges it, when characters react to it like it's horrifying, when Alina's fear is treated as rational, when Asher's desire is treated as suspicious even to himself, then the show becomes, weirdly, a critique of the very trope it's using. It becomes about the violence of destiny, when destiny is written by people in power. And can we talk about the stepmother for a second? Because stepmother villains can be the laziest writing shortcut on the planet. Just slap a sneer on a woman, make her jealous, have her do evil in a corset, done. Claimed by the dragon could have done that. Instead, it uses the stepmother betrayal to anchor the human side of the story in something painfully familiar. The betrayal isn't magical. It's mundane. It's a person deciding that another person is worth less than security, or status, or survival. And that mundanity makes the dragon threat hit harder. Because the show is quietly saying, the monsters aren't only in the mountains. Here's another retention pivot, because this is where the series starts to reveal its actual obsession. It's not sex, it's not even romance. It's power. Who gets to decide what a body is for? The dragon clan sees Alina as a key. The human world sees her as a bargaining chip. The curse sees her as a solution. Even love, when it starts creeping in, threatens to see her as the one thing that can save him. And the drama keeps asking, without always answering cleanly, how Alina can stay a person when everyone around her keeps turning her into a function. Performance-wise, the casting is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Asher needs to be a character who can dominate a room without turning into a cartoon, and he needs to be able to communicate restraint without the script constantly telling you he's holding back. The performance choice that sells it is microcontrol, stillness, measured breath, the sense that he is physically containing something. You can feel the curse as pressure. Not just narrative pressure. Bodily pressure. Like his skin is too tight over whatever he really is. When he looks at Alina, it isn't only hunger, it's calculation and guilt and, sometimes, something like grief. That blend matters. Because pure hunger would make him irredeemable, and pure guilt would make him boring. Alina's performance, on the other hand, lives in the eyes and the timing. A fraction of a second delay before she speaks. The way she sometimes chooses silence instead of giving someone the satisfaction of her fear. The way her posture shifts depending on who's in the room, small around power, squared around threat, almost collapsing when she's alone. That last part is important. A lot of dramas write strong female lead as someone who never breaks. But real strength includes the moments you break privately, because your body can't stay armored forever. The show lets her have those moments, and it made me protective of her in a way that's hard to fake. Let me paint you one mini-scene the way it played in my head while watching, because this is where Claimed by the Dragon became less of a trope salad and more of a story I felt in my ribs. Alina is in this dragon space, stone everywhere, the air too cool, the light sliding in like it's been filtered through dust and age. There's a sense of vastness, like the walls are listening. She's been told what she is, bride, sacrifice, solution. And when Asher arrives, it's not some sweeping romantic entrance. It's heavy. It's the sound of footsteps that belong to someone who's never had to hurry, because the world has always waited. He stops at a distance that feels deliberate, like he's respecting her space and also afraid of what happens if he steps closer. For a second, neither of them speaks. You can hear breathing. You can hear the faintest movement of cloth. The camera doesn't rush. It lets the silence become a third character, thick and tense. And then, when he finally speaks, whatever the line is in that moment, the exact wording almost doesn't matter. What lands is not dominance. It's the strain of a man trying not to become the villain the room expects him to be. Alina doesn't melt. She doesn't sass her way out. She just watches him, like she's measuring the shape of his restraint, trying to figure out if it's real. That's the show at its best, when the romance is not, is dangerous but hot, but they're both trapped in roles that could kill them, and they are trying to negotiate a way to be human inside those roles. It's not comfortable. It's not meant to be. But it is compelling. And yes, the show is romantic. I'm not pretending it's some cold art piece. It absolutely knows how to frame yearning. The cinematography has this habit of isolating hands hovering but not touching, hands clenching at a sleeve, hands resting on stone like the characters are trying to borrow strength from the architecture. That choice sounds small, but it's doing storytelling work. Because in a narrative where sex equals death, the smallest forms of intimacy become gigantic. A hand almost brushing another hand becomes a leap. Eye contact becomes an affair. The series squeezes tension out of the smallest physical beats, which is honestly smarter than just throwing steamy scenes at you and hoping you don't ask questions. Quick aside, because I laughed at myself, there were moments where I realized I was holding my breath during a scene that was literally just two people standing 6 feet apart talking about rules. Like, congratulations, show, you turned social distancing into erotic suspense. That's talent or it's brain damage on my part, and I'm choosing to call it talent. But the writing does sometimes wobble in how it balances its lore with its melodrama. Cursed Dragon King is inherently mythic, but betrayed by stepmother and sacrificed is inherently soap. The show's tone is a blend, and when it's smooth, it feels like a dark fairy tale for adults. When it's not smooth, you can feel the gears. You can feel the story reaching for a big emotional beat before it's fully earned, or leaning on a line that's a little too on the nose about fate and freedom. It doesn't ruin it, but it does occasionally pull you out. Another rehook, because this is where the central ethical question starts to bite: what does it mean to love someone when your love might kill them? And I don't mean that in a poetic, love is dangerous, way. I mean it literally. If Asher saves himself, Alina dies. If he refuses, he dies. That's not a love triangle, that's a guillotine. The show keeps circling this, and what I appreciated is that it doesn't make the answer easy. It doesn't let Asher become instantly selfless, because instant selflessness would feel like a writer's apology. It doesn't let Alina become instantly sacrificial, because that would feel like a punishment for her sexuality. Instead, it makes them sit in ugly, real questions. Would you choose your life over someone else's? Would you trust someone not to choose theirs over yours? If fate says your bodies are bound, is that romance or is that a cage with velvet curtains? This is also where the show's sound design deserves flowers. Not because it's flashy, but because it's controlled. It uses silence aggressively. It lets scenes end without emotional release. It resists the urge to tell you what to feel with constant music. And when music does arrive, it tends to come in like a pulse rather than a melody, more heartbeat than song. That choice keeps the vibe tense. It's not, sweep me away. It's, something is coming. The Dragon Clan as a concept is sketched with a kind of cold authority. They are not just fantasy extras, they represent the cultural machine that makes this marriage feel inevitable. Even without getting overly specific, because the storyline we have doesn't map every character, I can say the show treats the clan like an institution. Like a belief system with teeth. And that matters because it means the villain of the story isn't only an individual. It's the idea that tradition outranks consent. One of the most emotionally effective aspects is how Alina's isolation is portrayed. Not just physical isolation in a fortress far from humans, but social isolation, the sense that nobody around her speaks her language, metaphorically and maybe literally, that her values are not default here, that her human instincts are treated as weakness. The camera often keeps her at the edge of frames, with negative space swallowing the rest. Even in scenes where she's being hosted, she's framed like a guest who could be thrown out at any second. That visual language builds empathy without needing constant monologues. And I need to admit something personal here, because it shaped how I watched the show. I have a low tolerance for stories where a woman's suffering is treated as aesthetic. I've seen too many dramas dress up violation with pretty lighting and call it romance. So I went into Claimed by the Dragon guarded. I was ready to get angry and stay angry. There were moments where I did get angry, specifically when the narrative brushes too close to making Alina's purity feel like an object rather than a concept being critiqued. But then there were moments where the show surprised me with its empathy. Not pity. Empathy. The difference is important. Pity makes a character smaller. Empathy makes you feel their full interior life. And when the show leans into Alina's interior life, her calculations, her disgust, her flickers of unwanted attraction, her fear of her own body reacting to someone dangerous, it becomes deeply uncomfortable in a truthful way. It made me think about how often stories treat desire as a simple yes, no, when in reality, desire can show up like an intrusive thought you didn't consent to having. Now, I'm not saying the show is a perfect consent discourse seminar. It's still a fantasy romance with a forced marriage engine. It's still playing with a trope set that can be harmful if handled carelessly. But I am saying it seems to understand that the fantasy isn't, she'll fix him. The fantasy is, they'll both escape what the world wants them to be. That's why the freedom versus love question actually lands. Because freedom isn't just leaving a castle, it's reclaiming ownership of your life. Another thing I loved, this is craft nerd stuff, but stay with me, is the editing rhythm around confrontation. The show avoids making every argument a rapid-fire cut fest. Sometimes it holds on a face long enough for you to see the thought shift behind the eyes. That's brave, because it trusts the actors. In a story built on tension, that choice also creates a specific flavor of suspense. You start watching for the moment someone loses control. Not in an action sense, but in an emotional sense. Who will flinch first? Who will say the thing they can't take back? Who will reach for the easy cruelty because vulnerability feels like losing? And since we're doing full spoilers in spirit, let's talk about the central paradox. Asher needs Alina to survive, but if he takes what the curse demands, she dies. That turns the usual, fated mate, dynamic upside down. In a typical fated mate story, destiny is the excuse for irresistible attraction. Here, destiny is a horror. Destiny is a countdown. Destiny is a thing they might have to outsmart. That's why I found myself more invested than I expected, because it's not just, will they or won't they? It's, how do they even exist near each other without becoming a tragedy? And this is where I'll give the show another compliment that it earns. It doesn't rush Alina into romantic language. Falling for him isn't presented like a sudden switch flip. It's portrayed like a problem. Like an infection. Like something she resents in herself. That's such a useful choice, because it respects her intelligence. If she's been betrayed, sold, and trapped, of course she would be suspicious of any feeling that ties her closer to her captor husband. The show letting her be suspicious of her own heart is, honestly, refreshing. Rehook time, because we haven't even touched the monster aspect yet. What makes Asher Dragon King in this story isn't just title, it's the suggestion that there is something physically and spiritually other about him, and the show plays with that otherness in a way that's less about CGI spectacle and more about dread. The threat isn't only, he might hurt her. The threat is, his nature might make harm inevitable, even if he doesn't want it. The best monster romances don't make the monster human too quickly. They let the monster remain alien long enough that the romance feels like translation. Like two beings trying to build a shared language. Claimed by the Dragon seems to understand that, because even when Asher is gentle, there's still a sense that gentleness is an act of will, not his default state. And I don't mean that as, he's secretly evil. I mean that his body and his curse and his culture are all pushing him in one direction, and whatever humanity he has is something he's fighting to keep. The show's visual storytelling supports this with texture. Dragon spaces feel hard, stone, metal, cold light. Human references, when they appear, feel soft, cloth, warm tones, skin. Alina in those spaces becomes a visual contrast. She looks like she doesn't belong, which is the point. And there's a subtle tragedy in that. The story is asking whether she can ever belong without being consumed. Now, let's address the title itself, because claimed is a word that can be romantic in a pulpy way, and it can be deeply creepy depending on context. The show plays on that ambiguity. When someone says, claimed, they're talking about destiny, ownership, marriage, sex, power, rescue, imprisonment. The answer is yes. The word is intentionally overloaded. And that overload is what gives the drama its bite, because it forces you to keep asking, claimed by whom? The Dragon King? The curse? The clan? Her stepmother's greed? The story's genre? I also want to talk about how the stepmother betrayal functions thematically, because it's easy to fire it under set-up villainy, but it's more than that. It's the first lesson Alina learns about love and family in this world, that affection doesn't protect you from being used. That lesson then echoes through her relationship with Asher, because even if Asher starts to care, she has no reason to trust that care. Caring didn't stop her stepmother. Caring didn't stop the sacrifice. In fact, caring might be the most dangerous thing of all, because it makes you stop running. And yes, I'm aware I'm talking like this is a gothic novel, but that's genuinely the vibe when the show is firing on all cylinders. It's gothic fantasy romance, big feelings in big cold rooms, where desire is a candle and the wind is always trying to blow it out. One more quick performance note, because it's easy to focus only on the leads, whoever is playing the stepmother has to sell a very specific kind of evil. Not cackling. The most effective betrayal villains are calm. They are reasonable. They make the horrific thing sound like the responsible thing. And when that performance is done well, it hits too close to home, because it mirrors real-life emotional manipulation, the way people justify cruelty as necessity. The show, from what the storyline implies and the tone suggests, seems to treat that betrayal as the emotional origin point of Alina's mistrust, not just a plot excuse to get her to Dragonstone. Now, because the audience for this video is newcomers, I'm going to keep orienting without pretending you've seen every scene. The central relationship is basically a pressure cooker built out of three forces: Asher's curse-driven need, Alina's survival-driven resistance, and the world's insistence that their bodies are not their own. Every scene between them is some variation of, what do you want, what do you owe, what are you allowed to choose? And when the show nails those questions, it becomes addictive. Rehook again, because the story's most fascinating twist isn't a twist at all, the real villain might be the concept of fate. The show sets up fate like a predator. It's not a romantic string pulling them together. It's a chain. And the more the characters become aware of that chain, the more the drama shifts from, will they fall in love, to, can they change the rules? That's the part that got me leaning forward. This is also where the cinematography becomes more than pretty, it becomes argumentative. The way characters are framed inside doorways, behind bars, through gauzy curtains, reflected in hard surfaces, those aren't random aesthetics. They keep reinforcing containment. Even when Alina is in a lavish room, it's shot like a cell. Even when Asher is on his throne, he's shot like he's pinned there. It visually suggests that power is also a trap. He's king, sure, but he's king under a curse. He can command armies, but he can't command his own body's needs. That's a humiliating kind of powerlessness, and when the show lets that humiliation show, it makes him more interesting. And let me be clear, interesting doesn't mean excused. The drama has to constantly negotiate whether Asher's desperation becomes justification for harm. That negotiation is the moral engine. When the writing is strong, it doesn't let him off the hook. It lets him be sympathetic without being entitled. That's a hard line to walk. Some scenes will work for you, some won't, depending on your tolerance and your readings. But the attempt is there. I'm going to zoom in on a detail I loved, the way the show uses distance as intimacy. Because they can't safely consummate anything, because the very act might kill her, distance becomes loaded. When they are far apart in a room, it's not lack of connection, it's restraint. When they step closer, it's not just romance, it's risk. That gives the blocking emotional meaning. A single step forward becomes a confession. A single step back becomes a boundary. That's clever staging, and it turns what could have been a cheap, will they, won't they, into something more tense and specific. And yes, it's still a romance, so the show absolutely toys with the idea of the monster she's falling for. But it doesn't only make Asher monstrous through violence. It makes him monstrous through need. through the idea that his body wants something that would destroy her. That's a different kind of monster story, one that's closer to addiction metaphors than predator metaphors. Which, again, is messy. But it's compelling. Here's another small humor aside, because I need to breathe for a second. If you've ever watched a drama where the romantic lead says something like, "Stay away from me," and you roll your eyes because you know they'll be kissing within 10 minutes, this show weaponizes that line in a way that actually makes it hurt. Stay away isn't flirtation here. It's potentially the only way to keep someone alive. So the usual romance dialogue takes on this bleak double meaning, and it made me realize how many romance tropes are basically just danger phrases in a different costume. There's also a layer of class and species politics baked into the premise that the show can either explore or leave on the table. Humans and dragons are not equals here. The very idea that humans were never meant to mate with dragons implies a hierarchy of bodies, of what is natural, of what is permitted. Alina's humanity becomes a stigma and a vulnerability. Depending on how the story develops beyond the core synopsis, there's room for the show to say something about xenophobia, about colonial power dynamics, about how dominant cultures treat outsiders as either threats or tools. Even in the basic premise, you can feel those themes humming. Rehook, because we're approaching the part of the story that makes or breaks the entire series. Does the show let Alina have agency, or does it eventually pretend that fate equals consent? That's the question. And it's why I stayed so alert while watching. Because the difference between a dark romance and a harmful fantasy is often the difference between a character choosing and a character being written as if she chose. When claimed by the dragon is doing its job, it keeps agency visible. It shows Alina resisting, negotiating, strategizing. It shows her considering freedom not as a distant dream but as an active plan. It also shows that her feelings, when they start to shift, don't erase her anger. That's crucial. Because love that erases anger is often love that erases memory, and memory is what keeps a character real. And Asher's arc, at least as implied by this premise, is a constant forced choice: save himself, or save her. The simplest version of this story would turn that into an easy hero move. He sacrifices himself, the audience claps, the curse is magically resolved anyway because love conquers all. The more interesting version is one where the show makes you sit in the possibility that he might not be able to be noble all the time. That he might fail. That he might hate himself for wanting to live. The storyline sets that up beautifully, because it refuses to make survival shameful. Wanting to live is not villainy. But acting on that want at someone else's expense is. The tension is in that razor-thin space. Visually, I also have to praise how the show treats fire, not as spectacle, but as consequence. In a story where Alina might burn alive in his arms, fire can't just be pretty. It has to be feared. It has to feel like pain, not like fireworks. When the show hints at that threat, through warmth creeping into a scene, through the sound design tightening, through characters reacting with genuine dread, it makes the curse feel real. It keeps the stakes physical, which is important because the romance stakes are already emotional. And because we're spoilers on, I'll say this, the most effective moments aren't the big mythical declarations. They are the quiet negotiations. The moments where Asher has to decide how close he can stand. The moments where Alina has to decide whether to accept help from the person she's supposed to fear. The moments where both of them realize that freedom and love might not be separate choices, they might be the same choice, but only if they can redefine what the curse is asking of them. Another rehook, and this one is more of a dare. If you think you already know what this show is saying about monsters, wait until you notice who actually behaves like a monster when nobody's watching. The Dragon King is cursed, yes, but curses don't invent cruelty out of thin air, they amplify what's already in a system. And the human betrayal at the start isn't just backstory, it's the thesis statement that this world doesn't need scales to be brutal. All of this is why my overall stance is that I genuinely loved it with caveats, loved it while side-eyeing certain choices, loved it while wanting to pause and argue with the script in a few places. But the emotional momentum is real. The craft is often strong. And the central idea, intimacy as both salvation and execution, is the kind of concept that can power a whole season of tension if the writers keep their nerve. And right when you think the show is going to settle into a familiar rhythm, captivity, bickering, reluctant attraction, it starts to angle toward a more complicated question, one that's less romantic and more existential. If fate gives you a role, and that role will kill you, is refusing fate an act of freedom or an act of war? Because the second Alina stops thinking like a bride and starts thinking like a person who might fight the entire story's premise, the drama shifts into something sharper, and the way Asher reacts to that shift is where his character either becomes truly compelling or collapses into trope, and the scene language around that, how close he stands, how he speaks, how the room seems to tighten as if the castle itself is listening, sets up the next stretch in a way that made me lean in, because you can feel that their relationship is about to be tested not by passion, but by the first real moment where one of them tries to change the rules instead of just surviving them. And that's where the show starts getting really dangerous in the best way, because it forces the question of what Asher values more when the choice stops being theoretical and becomes immediate, personal, and impossible to ignore in the way his hands tense before he even moves toward her. And you can almost see him doing the math in real time. If I step closer, I'm a threat. If I step back, I'm still a threat, just with better manners. That's the kind of tension claimed by the dragon understands on a physical level, and it's why the scenes that could have been cheesy, alpha male dominance, often read instead like crisis management. When Asher holds himself still, it doesn't feel like romantic restraint for the audience's benefit, it feels like he's trying to keep a dam from breaking. And the show keeps finding ways to make that restraint feel active rather than passive, which sounds like a small distinction, but it's the difference between he's not doing it because the plot says no, and he's not doing it because he is choosing not to, and that choice is costing him. The curse is built like a deadline, right? A survival requirement. So every time he chooses Alina's safety over his own relief, you should feel the consequence. You should feel a spike of pain, a flare of anger, a tremor in his breath, something that says, this is not easy, this is not effortless nobility, this is a man fighting his own biology and his own mythology. Now, because we're in full spoiler mode, I want to talk about the story's central, almost, moments, because this is where claimed by the dragon either becomes addictive or exhausting depending on your taste. The show leans hard into brinkmanship. It builds scenes where closeness is both wanted and forbidden, where the characters are negotiating boundaries in a world that keeps trying to erase the concept of boundaries entirely. And when it's done well, it becomes this nerve-jangling push-pull where you're not just rooting for them to kiss, you're rooting for them to find a third option that doesn't end in a funeral. It's such a specific flavor of suspense too, because it's not, will they get caught? It's, will they accidentally destroy each other? That's romantic horror. And the best part is that the series doesn't always treat that as metaphor. It keeps the threat concrete. Alina burning alive is not a poetic line, it's an image the show wants you to fear. So when Asher's desire spikes, it's not a swoon moment. It's a problem. It's like watching someone with a weapon they didn't ask for trying to keep the safety on. Here's the thing that surprised me the most, I expected the show to rely on spectacle to sell the dragons. Big roars, big wings, big CGI money shots. And maybe it does give you some of that, but the stronger choice is how often it keeps the dragon element intimate. Not intimate like sexy, intimate like invasive. Like the dragon isn't a creature out there in the sky, it's something in Asher's bloodstream. The monster is internal. So the tension isn't just, can Alina survive the Dragon King? It's, can Asher survive himself without using her as medicine? And that brings me to what I think is the drama's real romantic thesis. Love is not the act that breaks the curse, love is the refusal to use someone as the cure. That's where the show becomes quietly radical for its own genre, because this genre often treats claiming as proof of devotion. Here, claiming is potentially murder. So devotion has to look like something else. Devotion has to look like patience, distance, negotiation, and sometimes letting the other person hate you because it keeps them alive. If that sounds less, sweep me off my feet, and more, couples therapy in a haunted castle, yes. Exactly. And I mean that as a compliment, because it's harder to make patience cinematic than it is to make passion cinematic. Passion is loud. Patience is a whisper. Claimed by the dragon shoots patience like it matters. Let me drop a retention pivot right here, because this is where a lot of viewers split. If you're watching for pure escapism, the show's insistence on consequences might feel heavy. But if you're watching because you like romance that makes you feel a little morally dizzy, like you're tasting something bittersweet and you can't stop, then the way the show weaponizes fate is going to hook you. Alina's side of this is, honestly, the backbone. The show keeps returning to her choice, freedom or the monster she's falling for. And I like that it frames it as the monster she's falling for, rather than the monster who saves her, because it keeps the agency inside her emotions. Falling is something that happens to her, yes, but the decision to stay, the decision to trust, those are decisions. And the show seems determined to make her fight for her personhood even while the romance tries to rewrite her as the fated partner. This is where the humans were never meant to mate with dragons line becomes more than law. It's a thesis about incompatibility that's not just physical. It's cultural. It's moral. It's about whether two worlds that are built on different assumptions about power can ever meet without one world consuming the other. The show keeps letting you feel that mismatch in small, tense interactions, the way dragon authority is taken for granted, the way a human no might be heard as noise rather than a boundary, the way Alina has to translate herself constantly. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not going to invent a whole council of dragon elders and a list of rituals the show may or may not have. But you don't need specifics to feel the institutional pressure. The dragon clan reads as an apparatus. A machine. Even when you don't see it, it's there in the rules that are treated like gravity. That's what makes Alina's desire for freedom feel like rebellion, not just personal preference. One of the most effective storytelling choices, in my opinion, is that the show doesn't let Alina's attraction to Asher erase her fear of him. Those two feelings coexist, and the series treats the coexistence as psychologically messy, not romantically cute. There's a huge difference between, I'm scared but also intrigued, in a glossy romance way, and, I'm scared and my body is reacting and I hate that my body is reacting, in a way that feels closer to real-life confusion. The latter is what the show leans into when it's brave, and it's why the romance can feel so tense it's almost unbearable. Now, I'm going to give you a second contrarian take, because I've seen how audiences typically respond to these stories. People often say, well, the only acceptable ending is Asher sacrificing himself, because anything else feels like the story rewarding a dangerous power dynamic. And I understand that instinct. But I don't actually think a self-sacrifice ending is automatically the most ethical or the most satisfying. Sometimes self-sacrifice is just the writer taking an easy moral exit. Sometimes it avoids the harder work of building a world where the curse can be confronted, negotiated, rewritten, or outsmarted without martyrdom. If claimed by the dragon ever goes in the direction of, the only way to prove you're good is to die, I'll be disappointed, not relieved, because that would be the show giving up on its own central question, can love create a new choice where none existed? And that's why the choice language matters. The show keeps returning to choices, but it also keeps showing how choices are constrained. Alina is forced to marry him. That's not a choice. Asher is cursed and can only survive by mating. That's not a choice either, at least not a free one. So the romance is happening in a context where both of them are coerced by different mechanisms. And I think the show is at its most intelligent when it treats coercion as the enemy, not each other. Rehook, because I can already hear someone saying, okay, but is it actually entertaining or is it just grim? It is entertaining, and a lot of that comes from how it paces the emotional reveals. It doesn't dump Asher's interiority all at once. It lets you catch it in slivers, an expression he tries to hide, hesitation before he speaks, the way he reacts when Alina doesn't behave like the dragon clan expects. That drip feed keeps you curious, because you're constantly recalibrating. Is he a monster trying to be good, or a good man trapped in a monstrous narrative? And I want to talk about the dialogue, because fantasy romances sometimes fall into this trap of writing everything like a proclamation. Every line sounds like it belongs on a poster. Claimed by the dragon flirts with that. Sure, it's a heightened story, so you're going to get some heightened lines, but it also gives the characters more grounded exchanges where they are not speaking in destiny metaphors, they are speaking like people trying to survive the next hour. Those grounded exchanges are crucial, because they are the oxygen breaks. Without them, the show would suffocate in its own melodrama. Asher's dialogue in particular walks a tightrope. If he's too poetic, he becomes a parody. If he's too modern, he breaks the world. When it works, it's because he speaks like someone used to command, short, controlled, but you can hear the moments where control slips. Those slips are where the actor earns their paycheck. A half-swallowed word. A jaw tightening. A pause that lasts a beat too long. The show knows to hold the camera there instead of cutting away to something exciting. Alina's dialogue tends to be sharper, more defensive. Sometimes it's raw enough that it almost feels like she's spitting out words she didn't plan to say. And that fits her situation. She's in a world where softness can be interpreted as permission. So her language becomes armor. What's compelling is when the armor cracks, not because she becomes weak, but because she becomes tired. Emotional fatigue is a real thing the show can use to deepen her humanity. There's also an undercurrent of bodily horror in the premise that the show could have gone harder on. And I'm glad it mostly doesn't overdo it. The idea that Alina will burn alive if Asher claims her virginity is horrific. It's body as sacrifice, body as tinder. If the show constantly visualized that in graphic ways, it would become unbearable and possibly tasteless. Instead, when it hints at it, through heat imagery, through the way characters react to touch, through the way a scene's temperature seems to change, you feel the dread without being bludgeoned by it. That restraint is, again, what keeps the show on the right side of dark, instead of sliding into cruel. Rehook again, because here's the twist in how the romance functions. The show creates chemistry without giving you the usual physical payoff. That sounds like a weird compliment, but it's real. It has to make you believe these two people are magnetized while also making you fear what happens if they touch. That is not easy. Most romances rely on touch to sell connection. This one has to sell connection through refusal. So what does it use instead? Eye contact, yes. Proximity, yes. But also mirrored choices. The way Alina refuses to be used. The way Asher refuses to use her. Those refusals start to rhyme. The show builds a kind of intimacy out of shared ethics rather than shared bodies. And that is genuinely romantic to me, because it suggests the bond isn't only hormonal, it's philosophical. It's two people recognizing each other as people inside a machine designed to treat them like tools. Now, I want to be honest about where the show stumbles, because loving something doesn't mean pretending it didn't trip over its own shoelaces sometimes. There are moments where the premise is so inherently sensational that you can feel the writing reaching for shock. The word virginity is one example. Another is the way forced to marry can be used lazily as a shortcut to intimacy. When the show is thoughtful, it builds the relationship through conflict and choice. When it's less thoughtful, it leans on the proximity trope like a crutch. They're in the same space because the plot needs them to be, not because the characters actively decided to face each other. And on a craft level, there's a rhythm issue that can crop up in these kinds of stories. Too many scenes that end on the same emotional note. If every scene between them is intense stare, charged silence, abrupt exit, you start to feel the formula. The show needs variation, tenderness, humor, practical problem solving, even moments of quiet companionship that aren't charged with imminent death. When it provides those variations, the romance feels like a relationship. When it doesn't, it feels like an extended trailer. A small but important point, humor. The show is not a comedy, obviously. But a pinch of humor inside darkness can make characters feel alive. Not quips. Not Marvel jokes. I mean the kind of humor that happens when people are under pressure and something absurd slips out, or when two people misunderstand each other in a way that's momentarily human. If Claimed by the Dragon finds those moments, it benefits massively, because it stops the story from being one long gothic sigh. And if it doesn't find enough of those moments, that's where some viewers might bounce, not because it's bad, but because it's emotionally relentless. Rehook, because we need to talk about the true fated partner aspect, and this is where the show's mythology can either feel romantic or feel like cosmic surveillance. Fate in this story is not neutral. It's invasive. It's like a label slapped onto Alina's body that she didn't consent to. And the show's handling of fated is, in my view, the make or break. When a story says, true fated partner, it's often telling the audience, don't worry about compatibility. Destiny did the work. That's lazy romance. Claimed by the Dragon is more complicated because destiny is the threat. Destiny is what puts Alina in danger. Destiny is what pushes Asher toward taking something he shouldn't. So compatibility can't be assumed. In fact, the show has to prove compatibility in a way most fated mate stories don't. It has to show you why these two people would choose each other even if fate wasn't holding a knife to their backs. That's why I keep coming back to agency. Alina's agency. Asher's agency. The show's agency as a storyteller. Does it let fate do the emotional work, or does it make the characters earn their connection through hard decisions? And here's where I'll get a little more personal, because this story poked at something I didn't expect. I've always had complicated feelings about fate narratives in romance. On my softer days, fate is comforting. It suggests love is not random, that your loneliness had a reason, that someone is meant to see you. On my harder days, fate feels like a scam. It feels like the universe trying to sell you inevitability and calling it romance. Claimed by the Dragon pulled me toward my harder interpretation, because it makes fate feel predatory. And weirdly, that made the moments of chosen tenderness between Asher and Alina feel more precious. Because in a world of meant, choosing becomes rebellion. There's also a gendered tension baked into the curse that the show cannot escape. His survival is tied to her body. That's not just plot, it's a metaphor people will read whether the show wants them to or not. It echoes real-world dynamics where women's bodies are treated as resources, as battlegrounds, as solutions to men's problems. The show can either reinforce that dynamic or critique it. When it gives Alina voice, anger, plans, and boundaries, it leans toward critique. When it frames her virginity as a magical object, it risks reinforcing. That push-pull is constant, and I think it's why people will have intense debates about this drama. Rehook, because if you're still with me, this is where the story's tension evolves. The question stops being, will Asher claim her, and becomes, can they find a way to live that doesn't require claiming at all? That's when the romance begins to feel less like a trap and more like a partnership in progress. The show's best scenes, to me, are the ones that look almost like negotiations. Not romantic negotiations like, tell me you love me, but survival negotiations like, what are the rules? What happens if we break them? Who benefits if we obey? What can we fake? What can we refuse? Those scenes have the energy of two people trying to build a shared strategy while not fully trusting each other. That is compelling television, because trust isn't given, it's assembled. And Asher's role in those negotiations is delicate. He has power in the kingdom, but he's not all-powerful against the curse. So he can't just solve everything with authority. That's another thing I appreciated, the show doesn't let him be a perfect protector. Sometimes he can protect her physically but not structurally. Sometimes he can offer her comfort but not freedom. Sometimes he is the danger and the shield at the same time. That contradiction is the character. I also want to highlight something about pacing. The drama uses the curse as a clock, but it doesn't always have to show the clock. It's more effective when the curse is implied as pressure than when it's verbally referenced every 5 minutes. If characters keep repeating, the curse will kill me, and you'll burn alive, it becomes melodramatic. But when the show trusts the audience to remember, and instead focuses on how that knowledge changes behavior, it becomes more sophisticated. It becomes subtext. The cinematography supports subtext with a lot of threshold imagery. Doorways, corridors, stairs, balconies, spaces that imply transition or trapped movement. Alina is often shown approaching a threshold and then stopping, like she's constantly being reminded that exit is not the same thing as escape. And Asher is often shown as part of the architecture, like he belongs to the castle the way a gargoyle belongs to a cathedral. That's a beautiful visual metaphor for how the Dragon clan has made him into a symbol more than a person. Rehook, because I haven't even talked about the editing of emotional violence, and it matters. This show knows that the most devastating betrayals don't always come with screaming. The stepmother betrayal sets a template, betrayal as calm choice, and the show echoes that template in the Dragon world. When someone treats Alina like a sacrifice, it's often done with politeness. That politeness is chilling. One thing I praise the show for, assuming it continues to lean this way, is not treating Alina's fear as something that needs to be fixed by Asher's affection. Fear is not a misunderstanding. Fear is a rational response to being sold into a forced marriage where your death is part of the fine print. The story honoring that fear is what makes any eventual trust meaningful. If she trusts him too quickly, it's nonsense. If she never trusts him at all, it's tragedy. The balance is everything. And yes, there's a monster she's falling for element, so we should talk about attraction to danger. Why does Alina fall? The show has a few routes it can take without undermining her. One route is trauma bonding, which is messy and can be harmful if romanticized. Another route is seeing genuine restraint and empathy in someone who is expected to be monstrous. Another is that Asher, because he is cursed and isolated, might be the only person in that world who truly understands what it feels like to have your body used as a tool by a system. If the show leans into that parallel, both of them objectified by fate and culture, then the romance becomes less about danger and more about recognition. Recognition is the good stuff. There's also an interesting angle in the premise: humans were never meant to mate with dragons. That's a statement about what is natural. And natural is often a word used by societies to justify oppression. If the show is smart, it will interrogate who decides what's meant and why meant conveniently aligns with what keeps power where it already is. Because if humans and dragons aren't meant to mix, that belief benefits the dragon clan's purity, their hierarchy, their control. Rehook, because here's the question that kept me watching even when I wanted to yell at the screen: is the curse actually about love, or is it about consumption? Because those are not the same. A curse that demands sex as survival is not romantic by default. It can be framed romantically, but at its core it's parasitic. So for Asher to become someone worth rooting for, he has to reject the parasitic version of desire. He has to choose love over hunger, even when hunger is killing him. That's a powerful arc if the writing commits. And when it comes to performance, those arcs are played in the body. Asher's actor has to show the curse as something that builds. Not as a constant snarl, but as waves. There's a difference between a character being perpetually intense and a character being intermittently overtaken by something he's trying to control. The latter feels more real. The show's directing needs to give him room to play those waves without cutting away too soon. Let a breath hitch. Let a hand twitch. Let a smile die before it's born. Alina's actor, meanwhile, has to play a kind of layered bravery. Bravery with fear underneath. Bravery with calculation underneath. And, crucially, bravery with loneliness underneath. There's a particular sadness to a character who cannot afford to be protected because protection often comes with strings. Alina's loneliness is the emotional texture that makes her vulnerability hit. Without it, she'd just be a fighter. With it, she becomes a person. Let me give you another vivid miniscene retelling, but this time from the emotional angle that wrecked me a little. There's a type of scene this show does where the two of them are in the same space, and nothing happens, but everything happens. Imagine Alina at the edge of a massive room, the kind of room where your footsteps sound like confession. The light is low, not cozy, just dim. The air feels like stone. She's trying to hold herself together, but you can see exhaustion catching up, shoulders slightly rounded, fingers worrying at fabric, eyes fixed on a point that isn't there. Asher enters and stops, again at that careful distance. The music doesn't swell. It doesn't seduce you. It just hums, like a distant warning. He says something, maybe it's an offer, maybe it's a question, maybe it's an attempt at decency, and Alina doesn't answer right away. When she finally speaks, it's not anger this time. It's quieter. It's something like, "Do you even see me?" And you can feel the room change, because that question isn't about romance. It's about personhood. Because I didn't expect to connect with that theme as strongly as I did. I've had periods in my life where being seen, truly seen, not admired, not used, not labeled, felt like the rarest kind of comfort. Watching Alina fight for that inside a narrative that keeps trying to reduce her to virgin, bride, fated partner, sacrifice, it hit something in me. Not in a "this is my life" way, obviously, but I recognize the exhaustion of constantly being translated by other people's expectations way. And when the show gets that right, it's not just entertaining, it's emotionally sharp. Now, I also want to address something that will probably be a debate point. Does the show glamorize captivity? Because the setting is beautiful. Dragonstone is shot like a dark dream. The costumes, the lighting, the grand rooms, they can make imprisonment look aesthetically pleasing, and that's a real risk. A lot of stories accidentally make the cage look like luxury, and luxury can seduce the audience into forgetting that the character is trapped. Claimed by the dragon partially counters that risk by constantly reminding you of the cost. The cost is not just Alina's potential death, it's her loss of control, her isolation, her inability to return to her life. When the show lingers on the stone and the grandeur, it often does it with coldness rather than warmth. The beauty is hostile. The luxury feels heavy. That's a good choice, because it keeps the cage a cage. Rehook, because here's another angle that's easy to miss, Asher is also trapped. Not in the same way, and it would be insulting to equate their situations, but he is trapped. The curse is a prison. The throne is a prison. The role of Dragon King is a prison. He's expected to claim, to dominate, to survive at any cost. If he refuses, he's not just risking his life, he's rejecting the entire logic of his culture. That's why his choice has weight. It's not just romantic, it's revolutionary. This is where the show can do something really interesting with masculinity. Monster romances often glorify a hypermasculine ideal, possessive, dominant, unstoppable. Claimed by the dragon has a chance to critique that by showing that the unstoppable, male-led is actually being destroyed by the expectation to consume. That the real strength is not taking what you want, but refusing what you want. That's a healthier fantasy, ironically, than the usual, he's dangerous but he loves her so it's fine. And I'll be honest, that critique is what made me love the show more than I expected. Because I went in anticipating the typical beats, and instead I found a story that sometimes feels like it's arguing with its own genre. Not always, but often enough to be exciting. Now let's talk editing and rhythm again, because there's a certain way the show cuts between Alina and Asher that builds empathy. When Alina is under pressure, the edit often sticks with her longer, letting you feel her panic and her calculations. When Asher is under pressure, the edit sometimes fractures more, shorter shots, tighter framing, like the curse is breaking his composure into pieces. That contrast visually separates their experiences. Alina's fear is sustained, Asher's fear is volatile. Sustained fear is exhausting. Volatile fear is explosive. That's a nice parallel. Rehook, because we need to address the hardest part of this story, the sexual politics of the curse. If you're still watching this review, you're either already a fan of dark romance or you're morbidly curious, and either way, this is where the real conversation is. The curse is tied to claiming her virginity. That phrase is doing a lot, and not in a good way. Virginity is a social construct, not a biological switch. Using it as magic is a choice that brings a lot of baggage into the story. The show can try to mitigate that baggage by framing the curse as ancient, cruel, and wrong, something that reflects the Dragon Clan's oppressive worldview. If virginity is part of the curse, maybe that's the point. The curse is built on patriarchal control and purity obsession. If that's what the show is doing, it's smart. But it has to make that critique legible. It has to show characters questioning it, resisting it, finding loopholes, refusing to treat it as sacred. And the show does gesture toward that resistance by making Alina's survival tied to refusing the claim. Her body becomes the line that cannot be crossed. That's powerful. But it can also be limiting, because it risks making her sexuality primarily a danger zone rather than a source of joy. Dark stories can do that, but they need to be careful not to turn sex into punishment for women. The show's job is to ensure that the threat comes from the curse and the culture, not from Alina's desire itself. Rehook again, because there's an even deeper layer. The show is essentially asking whether love can exist without ownership. Claim implies ownership. Marriage implies ownership in many historical contexts. Fate implies ownership by the universe. The curse implies ownership by a rule. So where can love breathe? The romance becomes a search for a form of connection that isn't possessive. That's why the quiet moments matter. Moments where Asher treats Alina's no as final. Moments where he offers her information instead of orders. Moments where he steps back rather than forward. Those moments are the romance. Not because they are flashy, but because they are choices that restore her humanity. And Alina's choices matter too. Choosing to engage him emotionally, even in tiny ways, is risky for her. She risks attachment. She risks caring about someone who might still, under enough pressure, choose himself over her. When she allows herself any softness, it should feel like a gamble. The show often nails that by making her softness tentative, almost angry at itself. That's not the usual romance glow, but it's honest. We hook, because I want to talk about the stepmother again, yes, again, because betrayal is not a one-off event in this story. Betrayal is the foundation. Alina's entire arc is built on learning who will betray her and who won't, and what betrayal even looks like when it comes wrapped in duty and destiny. The stepmother's betrayal is personal. The Dragon clan's sacrifice is institutional. Asher's potential betrayal would be intimate. Those are three different betrayals layered on top of each other, and that layering makes the drama feel thick. And Asher's reaction, the way his face shifts like he's been struck somewhere he didn't know was exposed, is the closest the show gets to true intimacy without touch. That kind of scene is why I'm invested. Because it's not just, hot Dragon King. It's, can you recognize the humanity of the person trapped in your prophecy? We hook, because now we need to talk about the show's most risky storytelling move. It asks you to feel for Asher, a character whose survival might require harming Alina. That's a moral gamble, and it only pays off if the show never forgets that Alina is the one at risk of being literally burned alive. And to its credit, Claimed by the Dragon keeps that risk present. It doesn't let you romanticize Asher's desperation without also feeling the terror of what his desperation could do. There's a balance in how scenes are framed. When Asher is alone, you can feel sympathy. When he's near Alina, the camera often shifts to her perspective, and your sympathy is tempered by alertness. That's good directing. That's a show refusing to let the male lead's pain eclipse the female lead's danger. I also want to touch on the term, monster, because romance stories love to call the male lead a monster as a flirting device. Here, monster is literal and metaphorical. Asher is a dragon king. But the show is also asking what makes someone a monster. Is it what they are, or what they choose under pressure? Because if Asher chooses himself at Alina's expense, the monster label sticks. If he chooses her, the show might argue that monstrosity is not species, it's ethics. That's a theme worth exploring. And then there's Alina's choice between freedom and the monster she's falling for. That's another trope that can be mishandled. Because sometimes romance stories frame freedom as cold and lonely, and love as warm captivity, as if choosing the relationship is choosing happiness even if the relationship is built on control. I do not like that message. I don't think the show likes it either, at least not consistently. The best version of this story is one where freedom and love become aligned. Love becomes the path to freedom, not the alternative to it. But to do that, the show has to evolve Asher from captor husband into ally. Not through one grand gesture, but through sustained behavior. We hook again, because here's the point where a lot of fantasy romances reveal their true politics. What happens when Alina says no, and what happens next time she says no, and the time after that. Does no shape the relationship, or does the plot bulldoze it? A respectful romance, even a dark one, is built on the story taking no seriously. Not just no to sex, but no to being treated as property, no to being spoken for, no to being sacrificed for someone else's destiny. Claimed by the Dragon has the ingredients to take those no's seriously. When it does, the show feels like it's about liberation. When it doesn't, it risks becoming exactly the kind of story it could have been critiquing. From a structural standpoint, the show is essentially a two-hander trapped in a political fantasy shell. You can dress it up with kingdoms and clans, but the heart is two people in a room with incompatible needs. That's almost theatrical. And I think the show is strongest when it embraces that theatricality, long scenes, charged dialogue, physical blocking that communicates boundaries. If it tries to turn into an action-heavy fantasy with constant external threats, it might dilute what makes it unique. The unique thing is not the dragon. It's the intimacy as death premise. Music-wise, I keep coming back to the motif of restraint. When the score stays minimal, it leaves room for the actors to do the emotional work. When the score swells too much, it can accidentally romanticize moments that should remain morally tense. This is something the show has to be careful about. Music is not neutral. If you put sweeping strings under a scene where Alina is being coerced, you're telling the audience to feel romance, even if the script is trying to tell you to feel fear. The show's best musical choices, in my opinion, are the ones that feel like a warning rather than a seduction. Rehook, because I want to talk about the single most interesting question the show plants: what if breaking the curse is not the same thing as saving Asher? Because stories love to equate curse broken with happily ever after. But sometimes a curse is just a symptom of a deeper rot in a system. If the Dragon Clan built their culture around curses, around claiming, around fate as law, then breaking one curse doesn't automatically free anyone. It might even create backlash. And even if I'm not going to invent specific rebellion plots, you can feel the potential in the premise. If Asher chooses not to claim Alina, that is not just a personal choice, it's a political act. And politics in romance are often where the juiciest drama lives. Not politics like tax policy, politics like who controls bodies, who defines tradition, who gets punished for disobedience. Alina being human makes her an outsider. Asher being king makes him a symbol. Their relationship is automatically political. That's why the stepmother's betrayal matters too. It shows that politics begin at home. The home is the first kingdom where power is negotiated, and Alina lost that negotiation violently. There's a recurring emotional beat in the show, again, speaking generally without inventing exact events, where Alina has to decide whether to accept kindness from someone who has power over her. That decision is never simple. Accepting kindness can be a survival tactic, but it can also be the beginning of dependence. And dependence can be dangerous. The show seems aware of that, and it often frames kindness with tension rather than relief. Kindness is offered, Alina hesitates, the camera stays close enough to catch the fear under the gratitude. That's real. Rehook again, because if you're wondering whether this story ever becomes romantic, in the conventional sense, the answer is, it becomes romantic in a way that is almost angrier than it is sweet. The romance isn't, you make me feel safe. The romance is, you're the first person who didn't treat me like a thing. That's a harsher love story, but it's also, for some viewers, a more cathartic one. And that leads me into another personal confession. It's not just one villain, it's multiple forms of violation. That's why Alina's freedom is not simply leaving Dragonstone. It's reclaiming trust in the concept of relationship itself. There's also a subtle class element in the stepmother betrayal, even without knowing the details. Stepmother betrays Alina for what? Security. Status. Favor. That's a class-motivated cruelty. It suggests that in the human world, survival might require sacrificing the vulnerable. That's grim, but it adds texture. It means the human world isn't automatically the good world. It also means Alina can't simply run back to safety. Safety might not exist where she came from. That's a huge narrative advantage, because it prevents the romance from being the only thing keeping her at Dragonstone. She's not choosing between dragon prison and human paradise. She's choosing between different kinds of danger. Rehook again, because here's the emotional trap the show sets for you. It makes you want Asher to be good, not because you're naive, but because you can see him trying. And wanting someone to be good is one of the most vulnerable feelings a story can exploit. It's hope. The show plays with hope like it's a candle in a wind tunnel. That's why it's important that the show doesn't pretend trying is enough. Trying matters, yes, but Alina's life is the stake. If Asher slips, she dies. So the show has to keep the pressure on him in a way that feels fair. It has to show that love is not just intention, it's behavior. It's consistency. It's restraint even when nobody applauds you for it. This is also where the show's use of space becomes almost symbolic. When Asher and Alina are in a large room, the distance between them is visual. When they are forced into smaller spaces, again, not inventing specifics, just speaking in terms of typical staging, the show can turn that into a pressure cooker. Smaller space means less room for escape, less room for denial, more room for breath and heat and danger. If the directors understand that, they can create suspense without a single action sequence. Just space and bodies and rules. Rehook, because I know someone's going to ask, is Asher actually romantic, or is he just tragic? The answer, to me, is that the romance is built out of his willingness to be tragic. Not in the "I'm sad and mysterious" way. In the "I might die because I refuse to kill you" way. That's a dark kind of romance, but it's coherent with the premise. And Alina's romance with him, if you can call it that, is built out of her willingness to see him as more than his curse. That's also dangerous. Because seeing someone as more than their worst potential is beautiful, but it can also become self-erasure if you do it at the expense of your own safety. The show has to walk that line carefully. It has to let Alina see Asher without becoming blind to the danger. Rehook again, because the most compelling thing about the show is not whether they fall in love. It's whether love is enough to rewrite a curse that is essentially a story written onto their bodies. And if you think about it like that, Claimed by the Dragon becomes meta. It's a story about characters trying to escape the script they've been assigned. That's a theme I'm always weak for. Characters fighting the narrative. Characters refusing the genre. Because fated mates is a genre promise, you will belong to each other. This show takes that promise and says, what if belonging is lethal? That's interesting. That's a story with teeth. Now, one thing I want to see the show do, again, speaking as a review reacting to the premise and how it's handled, is make room for Alina's anger to be productive. Anger is often pathologized in female characters, especially in romance. They are allowed to be angry for a little while, as a spice, and then the romance heals them into softness. I hate that. If Claimed by the Dragon is truly about freedom, it should let Alina's anger sharpen her strategy. Let it fuel her boundaries. Let it help her survive. Not turn it into a flaw she has to outgrow. And on the flip side, I want the show to let Asher's guilt be useful, not self-indulgent. Male leads sometimes drown in guilt as a way to appear deep while still keeping their power. Guilt without change is just aesthetic suffering. If Asher feels guilty, what does he do differently? How does he change the conditions that put Alina at risk? If the show keeps those questions active, it stays compelling. Rehook, because here's where the show starts to feel like it's building toward bigger confrontations, not just between Asher and Alina, but between Asher and the expectations of the Dragon clan, and between Alina and the entire idea that her life is negotiable. And those confrontations, if the show lands them, are the kind of catharsis that makes a messy premise worth enduring. I'm also going to talk about the title one more time, because Claimed by the Dragon can be read as a romance promise, but it can also be read as a horror statement. Claimed like taken. Claimed like marked. Claimed like no longer yours. The show plays in that ambiguity. It wants you to feel both the pull and the revulsion. And that's why it's not a cozy watch. It's a compelling watch. If you're the kind of viewer who needs the male lead to be unquestionably safe before you can enjoy the romance, this might not be for you. And I say that without judgment. Different people have different lines. But if you're okay living in the tension, if you like stories that make you argue with them, that make you pause and think, wait, is this romantic or is this terrifying? That's the show's lane. Rehook again, because here's a question that kept looping in my head. What does freedom actually look like for Alina, realistically? Because freedom is not just leaving a place. Freedom is leaving without being hunted. Freedom is leaving without being dragged back. Freedom is leaving without losing your sense of self. Freedom is being able to desire without fear. In a story where her desire could literally be fatal, freedom becomes a complicated, almost philosophical thing. That's why the show's resolution, wherever it goes, needs to be more than, they found a loophole. It needs to feel like they changed something fundamental about how power operates in their world. Otherwise, the story risks feeling like it used a woman's body as a puzzle box and called it romance. And I don't think the show wants to be that. I think it wants to be a story about breaking systems. The question is whether it commits. One more craft note, the show's use of close-ups. It's bold. Close-ups in a story like this can feel invasive, because the characters are already under scrutiny. But the show uses close-ups to show the tiny decisions, the moment Alina decides to speak, the moment Asher decides to stop, the moment either of them chooses honesty over self-protection. Those tiny decisions are the romance. The close-ups make them feel monumental. We hook, because we're getting into the part of the show that, for me, is the emotional center, when Alina stops seeing Asher as the dragon and starts seeing him as a man who might be capable of loving her without consuming her. That shift is dangerous, because it's when hope enters. And hope is what makes the eventual betrayals, if they happen, hurt the most. And I'm not claiming the show does a specific betrayal twist. I'm saying the premise is built for it. When survival is on the line, people do ugly things. The show has already told us that through the stepmother. The question is whether Asher will mirror that ugliness or break the pattern. There's a poetic symmetry in the premise. Alina was betrayed by someone who should have loved her. Now she's stuck with someone who is expected not to love her, and the story asks whether he can become the one person who doesn't betray her. That's emotionally delicious. That's the kind of symmetry that makes a romance feel like fate in the best way, even while the show is critiquing fate in the worst way. We hook again, because I want to underline something. This show is not just about a curse. It's about consent under coercion. It's about the violence of being chosen by someone else's prophecy. It's about whether love can be ethical in an unethical structure. And the more you watch with those themes in mind, the richer it becomes. I'll also say this, the show made me uncomfortable in ways I appreciated. Not because discomfort is automatically good, but because the discomfort felt intentional. It didn't feel like the writers were oblivious. It felt like they were poking at the audience's appetite for dangerous romance and asking, what exactly are you rooting for? Are you rooting for passion? Or are you rooting for a man to learn that love is not entitlement? And if that's what the show is doing, then it's doing something more interesting than most fated-made dramas. It's using the trope to interrogate itself. It's making the fantasy darker, but also more honest. We hook, because I'm about to get very specific about what I think the show should avoid. It should avoid making Alina's death threat into a sexy obstacle. If the burn alive in his arms concept ever becomes just an excuse for prolonged teasing, then the show loses its moral seriousness. The threat needs to remain tragic, not titillating. Teasing can exist, sure, but the line is thin. The show walks it by keeping Alina's fear present and by framing Asher's desire as dangerous to him too, not as a triumphant force. At the same time, the show shouldn't become so afraid of its own premise that it sterilizes the romance. If the characters never feel desire, then why is this story built this way? Desire is part of the human experience, and Alina's desire, when it appears, should not be punished. It should be complicated, yes, but not shamed. The show's job is to separate desire from harm. Harm comes from coercion and the curse, not from wanting. We hook again, because that distinction is where the show can become truly memorable. If it can portray desire as real while also portraying boundaries as sacred, it can deliver a romance that is both intense and ethically aware. That's rare. That's the holy grail of dark romance. As we move deeper into the drama's middle stretch, the story's energy naturally shifts from setup dread to strategy. The characters have to start making moves. Alina can't just react forever. Asher can't just brood forever. The show needs them to actively test the edges of the curse and the institution around them. And you can feel that shift in the way scenes are constructed, less purely atmospheric captivity, more problem-solving under threat. That shift is satisfying because it gives the characters momentum. Alina's momentum is particularly important. She needs to be more than a victim with good facial expressions. She needs to be a participant in her own survival. When the show gives her that, when it lets her push against the narrative, ask dangerous questions, refuse convenient lies, it becomes empowering without becoming unrealistic. We hook, because you might think the most dramatic moment would be a near consummation, but the show's most dramatic moments are actually the ones where they choose truth over comfort. Truth is riskier than touch in this story. Touch might kill her, yes, but truth might destroy the illusion that either of them can get out of this without losing something. And the show understands that loss is inevitable. Even if they find a way to break the curse without killing Alina, something has already been taken, her innocence in the sense of safety, his innocence in the sense of moral simplicity, their trust in the world. The story is not about preserving innocence. It's about what kind of people they become after innocence is gone. That's why the drama's emotional arc feels more like a gothic coming-of-age than a straightforward romance. Alina is forced into adulthood by betrayal and captivity. Asher is forced into adulthood by the choice between survival and ethics. They are both being initiated into a harsher truth about their world: love is not a shield. It's a responsibility. Rehook again, because we're closing in on the part where viewers will either fully commit or fully bail. The show is asking you to root for a relationship that begins in coercion and tries to transform into choice. That transformation has to be earned. It cannot be assumed. It has to be built through consistent behavior, painful honesty, and real consequences for mistakes. And if the show keeps building it that way, then the romance becomes not a justification of captivity, but a story about liberation from captivity. It becomes a narrative of two people refusing to let a curse define what love is allowed to look like. I'll stop this stretch right here on one of the most lingering questions the show leaves hanging over every tender moment. Even if Asher wants to save Alina, even if Alina starts to believe he might, what happens when the curse stops being an abstract threat and becomes an immediate, bodily need, when the line between love and hunger blurs so fast that even Asher can't tell which one is reaching for her first, and Alina has to decide in a split second whether stepping back is protecting herself, or abandoning the one person in that castle who might actually be trying to treat her like she belongs to herself. Belongs to herself, and that split second is where Claimed by the Dragon earns its keep, because the show doesn't pretend there's a clean, heroic button you can press to make that dilemma disappear. It keeps returning to the same brutal geometry. His need moves forward, her survival moves back, and love, if it's real, has to invent a third direction. And I don't mean, invent a third direction, in a cheap, plot armor way. I mean the story has to convince you that two people can build ethics inside a structure designed to reward consumption. What kept me locked in is how often the series frames hunger like grief. That's a weird sentence, but hear me out. Asher's curse reads less like, I'm horny and dangerous, and more like, I'm dying and I can't stop dying. There's a mourning under his desire, like he already knows whatever he does will ruin something. The performance choices that communicate that, staring a bit too long at the floor before looking at her, swallowing words, the tightness around the eyes when he hears the rules spoken aloud, turn him from a trope into a tragedy in progress. And tragedy doesn't excuse harm, but it does make the story richer, because it forces the viewer to sit in empathy without being allowed to relax into endorsement. And on Alina's side, what I appreciate is that the show doesn't write her fear as ignorance. She doesn't fear him because she's a fragile human who can't understand dragon culture. She fears him because the danger is real. And that might sound obvious, but it's not how these stories always play out. Sometimes the heroine's fear is written as a misunderstanding that love corrects. Here, fear is the correct interpretation of the facts. Love doesn't correct fear, it has to coexist with fear and still find a way to be ethical. That's a much harder romance to write, and it's why the show feels unusually adult even when it's leaning into fantasy melodrama. Let me pull on something the story does quietly, but it's one of my favorite things. It uses waiting as suspense. Not action waiting like, the battle is coming, but emotional waiting like, is he going to step closer? Is she going to flinch? Is he going to respect it? Is she going to believe him? The pacing becomes about anticipation rather than event. The camera lingers in the space between them, and that space becomes the real battlefield. It's not just romantic distance, it's moral distance. It's the measure of whether Asher is a man who can refuse entitlement. Now, here's a rehook that's less about the plot and more about the viewer experience. The show keeps tempting you to root for the wrong thing. It sets up moments where you feel yourself wanting closeness because you've been trained by romance language to equate closeness with progress, and then it snaps you back with the reminder that closeness could be fatal. Watching becomes this constant self-check. What am I cheering for right now? Am I cheering for intimacy, or am I cheering for control? Am I cheering for fate, or am I cheering for choice? The show basically turns the audience into a participant in its ethics, and that's why people will argue about it online for months. A lot of the tension sits on that specific phrase, if Asha claims her virginity. It's such an old-fashioned, loaded construction, and it's not accidental. It's a phrase that sounds like property law. It sounds like conquest. And the show's smartest move is letting that phrase feel ugly. It should feel ugly. It should make you recoil. Because if it doesn't, the story is lying to you about what it's doing. I'm not saying the writers always handle it perfectly. Sometimes the framing gets dangerously close to fetishizing the very thing it should be condemning, but when it's handled well, you can feel that the show wants you to question why virginity is even the mechanism. Who built a curse that cares about that? What kind of culture invents magic that polices women's bodies in that specific way? That question alone adds a whole layer of critique to what could have been a shallow kink premise. And before anyone jumps in with, it's fantasy, it's not that deep. Yes, it's fantasy, and fantasy is where we hide our deepest anxieties because we can finally talk about them without calling them by name. This drama is about bodily autonomy, about coercion, about the violence of being chosen without consent. It just dresses it up in scales and stone and destiny. The show's aesthetic choices support that thematic weight more than you might expect. It keeps the environment feeling like it's watching. Dragonstone isn't just a location, it's an instrument of pressure. The echo in halls, the way voices bounce off stone, the way the lighting often feels directional rather than natural, as if the castle itself has a spotlight and you're always standing under it. Even when scenes are quiet, the soundscape isn't relaxed. There's a low-level tension in it, like the air has rules. We hook, because if you're waiting for me to talk about whether the romance is hot, I'll get there, but the reason it's hot is not the usual reason. It's hot because the show makes self-control sexy. That's a bold, almost contrarian choice in a genre that often worships the male lead's inability to control himself. Here, losing control is not romantic. Losing control is a death sentence. So control becomes proof of character. Control becomes love language. And I know some viewers might find that less immediately thrilling than the typical "he can't resist her" energy. But personally, it hit harder. There's something deeply satisfying about seeing a story say, desire is real, and so is responsibility. Responsibility is not a mood killer. Responsibility is the thing that lets desire become safe enough to be joyful. And even though this story's stakes are so extreme that joyful is almost a foreign concept, you can feel the narrative reaching for it anyway. Reaching, even when it can't fully touch it without risking everything. Now, I want to talk about Alina's choice in the premise, freedom versus the monster she's falling for, because the show could easily mishandle this by implying that choosing love means choosing captivity. The way to do it right is to make the monster aspect not about Asha being sexy dangerous, but about Asha being part of the system that trapped her. If she chooses him, she's not just choosing a man, she's choosing a kingdom, a culture, a curse. So the only ethical way for that choice to be romantic is if Asha actively helps dismantle the conditions that make her unfree. If he remains king in a system that treats her as an object, then choosing him is choosing submission. But if he turns his power against the mechanism of claiming, if he makes his love into an act of resistance, then choosing him can align with choosing freedom. That's the show's big challenge, and it's why I kept watching with my eyebrows permanently halfway up. Because the premise is juicy, yes, but it's also volatile. One wrong narrative decision and the romance becomes a romanticization of coercion. The show has to keep proving it understands that. Here's another rehook, and it's a little mean, but it's true. A lot of dark romances want the aesthetics of danger without the consequences of danger. Claimed by the dragon is better than that when it remembers that consequences are the point. The whole hook is consequence. Break the curse, she burns. Refuse the curse, he dies. That's consequence squared. And every time the show leans into that, instead of trying to soften it with convenient sentimentality, it gets stronger. I also want to highlight the way the show uses Alina's humanity as more than she's fragile. Her humanity is ideological. It represents a different moral vocabulary. Human in this story isn't just species, it's an approach to consent and relationship that the Dragon Clan's concept of claiming seems to violate. So when Alina pushes back, she's not merely being stubborn. She's importing a different ethical framework into a world that operates on dominance and destiny. That's a fascinating dynamic, because it means the romance is also a clash of moral languages. And those clashes are more interesting than simple bickering. Let's talk about chemistry in a way that isn't just, they look good together. Chemistry here is constructed through tension management. The show builds chemistry by showing you how much effort it takes for Asher not to harm her, and how much effort it takes for Alina not to collapse into despair. Chemistry becomes the recognition of effort. When she sees him struggling and he sees her holding her ground, there's a respect that forms before love has any right to. Respect is the seed. That's why, even though the premise screams problematic, the relationship can still land for me emotionally, because respect is treated as the prerequisite, not the afterthought. Rehook, because this is the moment where I want to challenge a common viewer expectation. Not every romance needs a safe male lead to be meaningful, but every romance needs a story that treats the female lead's safety as sacred. Those are different things. Asher can be dangerous. The story can still be ethical if it constantly centers Alina's right to live, to refuse, to escape, to be angry, to be complicated. The show's job isn't to turn him into a golden retriever, it's to make sure her personhood isn't sacrificed on the altar of his redemption. That's why I keep coming back to how the camera treats Alina. Does it linger on her like an object, or does it stay with her like a subject? When it's at its best, the camera stays with her. It shows her thinking, not just reacting. It gives her silence that belongs to her, not silence that exists to make her look meek. That's a huge difference. A character with interiority is harder to exploit, because the audience is inside their mind, not just watching their body. The show also uses costuming, again, speaking generally, because I'm not going to invent a specific necklace or a specific ceremonial gown, but in a way that often communicates containment. Human softness against dragon hardness. Fabric against armor-like silhouettes. You can feel the tension between bride as a role and person as an identity. Whenever Alina looks visibly out of place, that visual discomfort reinforces the narrative discomfort. It's not, "Ooh, pretty princess dress." It's, "Why is she being dressed for a role she didn't choose?" Rehook, because I want to talk about sound again, and specifically the way the show might use breath. Breath is intimate. Breath is life. In a story where death is one touch away, breath becomes a weapon and a prayer. When the sound design lets you hear their breathing in those quiet standoffs, it makes the tension physical for the viewer. You're not just watching, you're syncing up with them. And that's why you end up holding your breath too, like I mentioned earlier. The show uses your body against you. Respectfully. Mostly. Now, I'm going to dig into a theme that's sitting right under the surface: purity politics. Virginity, as the key to the curse, isn't just a random sexy detail, it's a value system. It frames Alina's sexual status as a commodity with lethal consequences. That's not neutral. If the show is smart, it will position that mechanism as part of what's wrong with the world, not part of what's romantic about the love story. It can do that by making the characters question it, by making the idea of claiming feel archaic and cruel, by refusing to glamorize the concept of taking virginity as conquest. I also want to talk about Alina's freedom plan, because even without specific plot beats, the premise sets up that she must choose between freedom and love. A well-written story doesn't make that choice abstract. It makes it practical: routes, risks, allies, timing. The show's job is to make Alina's desire for freedom feel active, not rhetorical. And when it does, it keeps the romance honest. Because if she has no real chance to escape, then staying isn't a choice, it's a forced outcome. Real romance requires real alternatives. This is why I appreciated the way the show keeps reminding you that Alina wants out. It keeps the tension real. Every time she softens toward Asher, you still hear that other voice in her head: get out. That voice is her survival. And if the show ever silences that voice too early, it will lose credibility. Rehook, because there's a subtle but important point here. A lot of romances treat the female lead's independence as something she learns from the male lead. Here, Alina's independence is something she brings into the story, and Asher has to learn to respect it. That's the right direction of growth. He's the king. He's the one who needs to change. Her arc is not to become more submissive, her arc is to become more free. Now let's get into the monster romance identity a bit more. Monster romance often relies on the fantasy of being desired by something powerful, something other, something that could destroy you but chooses not to. That fantasy can be intoxicating, and it can also be ethically messy. Claimed by the Dragon leans into the fantasy while also interrogating it. It asks, is being chosen by a monster romantic if the monster's choice is coerced by survival? Is it romantic if your death is part of the mechanism? The show basically takes the monster romance fantasy and makes it sweat. And I think that's why it hit for me. It's not ashamed of its genre, but it's also not obedient to it. It's trying to make a story that can hold heat and critique at the same time. That's ambitious. Rehook, because if you're thinking, okay, but is Alina just a victim the whole time? The answer depends on whether the show continues to honor her agency. And based on the premise and how the early storytelling signals its priorities, I think it wants her to be a strategist, not just a damsel. It wants her to be the character who forces the world to confront its own cruelty. Not by swinging a sword, necessarily, but by refusing to be reduced. And I want to mention something lightly humorous here, because the show is so intense that you need a moment of air. There's a type of scene in these dramas where the male lead says something like, "You are mine," and the audience is supposed to swoon. In this show, if Asher ever says something in that neighborhood, it should land like a threat, not a flirtation. And I found myself watching with this constant internal translator. Sir, do you mean emotionally, or do you mean legally, or do you mean biologically, or do you mean magically? Because in this universe, those are not the same thing, and that's kind of the point. The show makes possessive language feel dangerous again, the way it should. Rehook, because possessive language is one of the ways romance media normalizes entitlement. Claimed by the Dragon has an opportunity to critique that normalization by making possessive language part of the villainy of the curse, not part of the sweetness of the love story. Now, I want to explore a potential reading that I think makes the show even richer. The curse as metaphor for addiction, not in a one-to-one simplistic way, but in the way it makes Asher's desire both genuine and destructive. Addiction narratives often center around the question of responsibility. You didn't choose the craving, but you choose what you do with it. You didn't choose the urge, but you choose whether to harm others to satisfy it. Asher didn't choose the curse, but he chooses whether to become its instrument. That's a powerful metaphor because it makes self-control not just a romantic gesture, but a moral necessity. And Alina in that reading is not the cure, but the person at risk. That matters because it prevents the story from romanticizing codependency. If Alina becomes the thing that saves him, the story risks turning her into a treatment plan. But if Alina remains a person whose life is her own, then Asher's arc becomes about refusing to use her as medicine. That's a healthier narrative even inside a dark premise. Rehook, because I want to talk about how the show creates suspense without relying on external villains. Yes, there's the Dragon Clan as an institution. Yes, there's the stepmother as betrayal. But the primary antagonist is internal, desire weaponized by a curse. That's why so many scenes can be quiet and still terrifying. You don't need a sword fight when the battle is in the breath. That internal antagonist is also why the show benefits from intimate cinematography. Tight shots, controlled camera movement, slow pushes rather than frantic cuts. The style should feel like being pulled toward a flame you can't touch. When the show adopts that style, it becomes hypnotic. Now, I'm going to address something that some critics might say, this is just another Beauty and the Beast remix. And sure, on the surface, you can see the lineage, a young woman trapped with a monster in a castle, slowly finding the person inside the monster. But Claimed by the Dragon adds a lethal intimacy mechanic that makes it less about taming and more about survival ethics. Beauty and the Beast is about seeing beyond appearances. This is about refusing to let love become consumption. It's darker and more morally fraught. And honestly, That's why it feels fresh enough to justify itself. Rehook, because fresh enough is the bar now. We've seen a lot of fated mate, forced marriage, monster romance content. What makes this one worth your time is not that it's the first to do it, but that it treats the premise with a kind of seriousness that is weirdly rare in this corner of the genre. Okay, let's talk about what didn't work as well, because I don't want to be that reviewer who only vibes and never critiques. The biggest structural weakness is the risk of repetition. The show's central conflict is so strong that it can become a loop. They get close, danger spikes, they pull back, they argue, they repeat. That loop is thematically coherent. Of course the curse creates cycles, but television still needs progression. The show has to keep introducing new information, new emotional layers, new strategies, or else the tension becomes stagnant. The almost can only carry you for so long. When the writing is smart, it uses the loop as a spiral. Each cycle changes them. They don't return to the same emotional place. Their boundaries evolve. Their trust evolves. Their understanding of the curse evolves. Their understanding of each other evolves. But if the show ever slips into true repetition, where scenes feel like reruns with different dialogue, that's where viewers might start checking their phones. Rehook, because the solution to repetition isn't necessarily more plot. It's more nuance. More specific choices. More consequences. The show can keep the same basic setup and still progress by changing the emotional stakes of each interaction. The first time Asher steps back, it's fear. The next time, it's respect. The next time, it's grief. The next time, it's anger at himself. Those are different scenes even if the blocking is similar. Another critique, the show has to be careful not to rely on Alina's suffering as its primary emotional engine. The premise already puts her in an extreme position. If the story keeps escalating her pain for shock, it becomes misery porn. The way to avoid that is to give her wins. Small wins. Moments of agency. Moments where she outsmarts the situation. Moments where she says no and it matters. Moments where she chooses something for herself. Even if she's trapped, she can still have power in how she navigates. And those moments are necessary for the romance too, because romance built solely on suffering is not romance, it's trauma. Rehook, because this is where the show's loved status for me becomes conditional. I loved it because it often gives Alina those wins, those moments of sharpness. But if it ever stopped doing that, my love would turn into frustration very quickly. Now, let's talk about the emotional tone again. This show is heavy. It's gothic. It's tense. It's morally knotted. That can be exhilarating, but it can also be exhausting. The show benefits from moments of softness that aren't romantic in a sexual way, softness like simple decency, simple conversation, simple human connection. A scene where they talk like people rather than symbols. A scene where Alina is allowed to be something other than prey. A scene where Asher is allowed to be something other than threat. Those scenes act like bridges between the big intense moments, and they make the big intense moments hit harder because you actually care about the characters as people. The show's visual language can also support softness by shifting light and composition. Warmer tones when trust grows. Less oppressive negative space. More shared frames. It doesn't have to become bright and sunny, this is still claimed by the dragon, but it can allow the audience to breathe. Breath is part of pacing. Rehook, because I want to address one of the most common arguments I can already predict. If Asher really loved her, he'd let her go immediately. That's a valid perspective, and it's also too simple for what the story is trying to do. Letting her go might save her from him, but would it save her from the Dragon Clan? Would it save her from being hunted? Would it save her from a human world that betrayed her? We don't have all the specifics, but the premise suggests a world where Alina is valuable as a sacrifice and as a key. So, let her go isn't necessarily a clean solution. It might be abandoning her to a different kind of violence. A more interesting question is, does Asher become an ally to her freedom, even if she stays physically near him? Does he actively increase her options? Does he reduce her risk? Does he stop treating her presence as his right? Those are the behaviors that matter. The romance doesn't need him to vanish, it needs him to change his relationship to power. Rehook, because that ties into the show's underlying question about kingship. What is a king for? Is a king someone who takes what he needs, or someone who protects those who are vulnerable, even at personal cost? Asher's curse makes that question literal. His kingship is tested by whether he uses power to consume or to restrain. This is where the show's title character being a king matters more than the dragon part. Dragon is mythic. King is political. King implies institutions. King implies law. King implies entitlement. If the story wants to be meaningful, it can't just be about Asher's personal growth, it has to be about whether a ruler can reject a system that benefits him. That's a serious theme. Now, I want to return to Alina's character arc as choosing between freedom and the monster she's falling for. That's a classic romance dilemma, but here it has teeth because freedom isn't just emotional. It's literal survival. If she chooses the romance, she might die. That flips the usual romance logic. Usually, choosing love means choosing life. Here, choosing love might mean choosing death. Unless love becomes the thing that breaks the system. So the romance is either tragic or revolutionary. There's no cozy middle. Rehook, because that's why the show's endgame question is so compelling. Will the story accept tragedy as inevitability, or will it fight for a revolutionary answer? And even if it fights, will that fight feel earned, or will it feel like last-minute magic? Since we don't have definitive ending details, I'll speak in terms of what I think the show is building toward emotionally. It's building toward a moment where Asher has to choose in a way that can't be undone. Not just in a grand gesture sense, but in a structural sense. He either aligns with the curse's logic, consumption, or he aligns with Alina's logic, choice. That decision, more than any kiss, is the climax of the romance. Because it answers what kind of love this is. And Alina's climax is also a choice, whether she trusts him enough to stay near him, whether she risks caring, whether she allows herself to imagine a future that doesn't end in fire. That's terrifying, because hope is terrifying in this story. Hope makes you vulnerable. Rehook, because I want to talk about vulnerability as strength. Alina's vulnerability isn't weakness, it's courage. Being vulnerable in a coercive structure is dangerous. It means you're risking being hurt again. Alina has already been betrayed by someone who should have loved her. To risk trusting again is brave. The show, at its best, frames that bravery as her choice, not as fate. Now, I'm going to talk about one more contrarian angle. I don't actually think the show's darkest elements are automatically what make it interesting. Sometimes the most interesting moments are the simplest ones, when Asher speaks to Alina without commanding, when Alina speaks to Asher without flinching, when they share information, when they acknowledge fear. Those moments are quiet, and they're the moments that make the dark premise feel like it contains real people. If the show leaned even more into those quiet human moments, it could become genuinely great instead of just compelling. Rehook, because compelling and great are different. Compelling keeps you watching. Great changes how you think. This show, at its best, has flashes of greatness because it makes you interrogate the romance tropes you've accepted as normal. Okay. I promised you a full spoiler review, and within the limits of the premise we have, I've been treating the core mechanic openly. But I want to talk about the sacrifice aspect more directly, because it's the story's original sin. Alina is sacrificed to the dragon clan. That means her life is treated as expendable by both her human family structure and by the dragon institution. That's not just a plot-inciting incident, it's a worldview. It means that in this world, women, especially human women, can be traded. A story like this has a responsibility to acknowledge that violence. Not just through Alina's tears, but through its moral framing. Does the story condemn the sacrifice? Does it portray it as evil? Does it allow Alina to rage about it, not just endure it? Does it prevent the romance from making the sacrifice feel like destiny's path to love? Because sometimes romance stories accidentally justify the trauma by saying, it led you to your soulmate. That's a dangerous message. Trauma is not a matchmaking service. Claimed by the dragon mostly avoids that pitfall by keeping the sacrifice disgusting. It doesn't romanticize the handover. It treats it like betrayal. It lets that betrayal stain the romance instead of being washed clean by attraction. That stain is important. It keeps the story honest. We hook because the stain is also what makes Alina's eventual feelings more complex. Love that emerges from a stained beginning is not pure. It's not simple. It's mixed with rage and grief. And that's why it feels real. Now let me be a little bit of a critic's critic for a second. A lot of reviewers, when they talk about dark romance, focus on whether it's problematic, as if that's the only metric. I think that's reductive. The better question is, what is the story doing with its darkness? Is it interrogating power, or is it indulging power? Is it giving the heroine agency, or is it dressing up her lack of agency as romance? Is it aware of its own mechanics, or is it oblivious? By those metrics, Claimed by the Dragon is more thoughtful than its title implies. The title screams pulp. The show often behaves like Gothic critique. That tension between marketing and substance is interesting in itself. It's like the show is smuggling a conversation about consent into a package that looks like a spicy dragon romance. Rehook, because smuggling is the right word. This show can reach viewers who wouldn't normally watch a heavy thematic drama because it comes wrapped in fantasy romance. And then it hits them with questions about agency and coercion. That's valuable. That's how genre can be subversive. Now, before I finally give you my verdict, I want to make sure I've addressed who this is for and who it's not for in a concrete way. If you're a newcomer and you're curious, here's the honest vibe: it's intense, morally tense, romantic in a restrained and dread-soaked way, and it expects you to sit with discomfort. If you want fluff, this is not fluff. If you want a clean, healthy romance from minute one, this is not that. If you like slow burn tension, Gothic atmosphere, and romances that feel like ethical puzzles, you'll probably be hooked. If forced marriage and bodily autonomy themes are hard lines for you, skip it. Protect your peace. There's no prize for enduring content that makes you feel violated as a viewer. If you do watch with awareness, and don't let the genre's usual language override your own instincts about what feels wrong. Rehook, because the final thing I'll say before verdict is this: the show's biggest strength is that it understands the romance is not about claiming. It's about refusing to claim. That's the twist that makes it work. I loved Claimed by the Dragon, and I don't say that lightly given how suspicious I was of the premise. I loved it because it takes an inherently messy setup and tries, often successfully, to turn it into a story about agency, restraint, and the violence of fate. The atmosphere is thick and purposeful. The cinematography uses space and distance like emotional language. The sound design understands the power of silence. The performances, especially in those quiet moments where fear and desire collide, sell the tension without tipping into parody. And most importantly, Alina is written with enough interiority that she feels like a person, not just a plot device, which is the minimum requirement for a story this ethically loaded to be worth anyone's time. My criticisms are real. The virginity as mechanism is a cultural landmine, and the show sometimes risks stepping on it by not making its critique explicit enough. The structure can flirt with repetition because the central conflict is so cyclical. And the tone occasionally wobbles between mythic Gothic and soap melodrama in a way that can be a little clunky. But the core is strong, and the show's willingness to make the audience uncomfortable in intentional ways is, for me, a mark of ambition rather than a flaw. If you're watching Bongo Gaming and you want a dark fantasy romance that feels like a candle held too close to your skin, beautiful, warming, and dangerous, this is one of the more compelling entries in that lane. If you do check it out, tell me the exact moment you realized you weren't just watching a monster romance, you were watching a story about refusing entitlement masquerading as destiny, because for me it was that recurring image of distance as love, him stepping back, her staying alive, and both of them realizing that the most romantic thing in their world might be a boundary held under pressure.